Right.
All right, we are recording, and my name's Cassie Sheets. I'm the Executive Director of Writing Coaches of Montana. We also have Jeannie Dowan here, who is our Flathead Coordinator. And we also have Rita Braun, a board member, and 3 outstanding volunteers. We might have some more coming in as well. And I'd like to turn it over to Kathy Dunnehoff, who's a wonderful faculty member at Flathead Valley Community College, who is willing to share with us all of her expertise in writing workshops and giving criticism in a positive manner. So Kathy, let me turn it over to you. Thanks for being here tonight.
All right, you bet. And I said earlier you may hear a Yorkie bark because my husband's gonna come home any minute. It'll be like a little ruckus, but I'm fine. So I just put a handout in the chat box that I'm gonna sort of follow today, and then ask questions along the way. Just whenever you want. If something pops up in the chat box, I don't always see it. So Cassie, if you would just flag that for me, because I tend to not look down there. I'm looking at people's faces as I go. So I've taught writing for 32 years at FVCC here in Kalispell. And prior to that, I taught a little bit at U of M when I was finishing grad school there. And I'm also a writer. And I think that being a writer has informed my teaching writing, because for me, it's really about practical tools that have interested me, because you have to be able to put it in your hand and use it. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is just kind of shortcuts, kind of easy things to do in terms of giving feedback, and I hope will be useful for you to communicate to the writers as well. And again, interrupt anytime that you want. I wanted to start with the first thing that I always want to know when I'm guiding someone in their writing. And it's easy when you're the teacher because you know what the assignment is, you know what it is they're supposed to be doing. But I worked in the writing lab at FVCC, I worked in the writing lab at U of M, and you really need to know what the assignment is, because I always think of it, you can polish up the apple all you want, but if they need a banana, you failed. And I've even done that with, yeah, you can tell. My husband's home, so the dog's barking. He'll close the door. Close the door. No, with the dog on the other side. There we go. The dog wanted to stay in. I've even made that mistake when I'm the teacher, where someone turns in a piece of, I mostly teach fiction now, but I taught, composition and tech writing and all of that over the years. But a student will turn in something and I read it as if they're the beginning pages of a novel or the beginning pages of a story. And I start to get feedback. And then the student later says, oh, well, this is actually on page 29 of this piece that I'm working on. Well, the opening pages are wildly different than page 29. And so the questions that I've been asking, the things I feel are missing, aren't accurate, because by page 29, we would know those things. So first, find out what it is that the assignment is. Students aren't always good at explaining that, of course. And often they'll have something from the teacher that says, this is what it is. And definitely, if you can get that and take a minute to look at it, it makes a huge difference, because their ability to explain it, and you're looking at what the actual guide that the teacher gave them, or the whatever it is, rubric or whatever it is that the teachers put together. So that's one thing I always want to make sure I know. What am I helping them do in the first place? That makes a big difference. The second thing I always really want to know is, where are they in the writing process? And it's not always obvious, because sometimes students do a lot of pre-writing in their head. So they've done a bunch and they're ready to actually sit down and write up what's probably a pretty good draft. Sometimes students have done a bunch of writing. They've actually written a bunch of stuff, but it's really them thinking through. So they're really at the beginning, even though they might have pages. And one thing that really helps, I think, a lot is, you'll see on there, there's a way to break down the writing process into 3 steps. And it's think it up, write it up, fix it up. And students are sometimes reluctant, adults as well, to break down the writing process because they feel like it'll take too much time and they kind of want to get it done if it's an assignment. But when you think it up first, spend some time sort of thinking about it, then you write a draft, usually as quickly and freely as possible without being fussy. And then you do the fixing it up. And the more you divide those three things as a writer, not only is the process way more pleasant, but you end up with better writing. And what frequently happens is people will sit down to write and they feel like it has to be perfect, but they haven't given it any thought. They haven't done any loose outlines of any kind. And they sit down and they write 2 words, and then they get rid of one. Then they write a sentence, but that's not right. And is this word spelled right? And do they need a comma? And by the time they're done, they've spent 2 hours and they have basically nothing. So the think it up, which can be it can be outlining, it can be note taking, it can be doodling, it can be a conversation. I'm going to talk quite a bit about that today as a way to guide people in their writing. And sometimes think it up is procrastination. So it looks like the student's done absolutely nothing. But when you talk to them, you'll realize they've been thinking about it. And that's always the first step of writing. So sometimes a writer will come to me and they'll say, oh, I've been thinking about writing this thing for a long time, and so I'm nowhere. And the opposite is true. They've moved along exactly the way they should because they've started by just sort of thinking about it. And talking about it makes a huge difference at that stage. You'll get students who are there, who are like, well, I have this assignment, haven't done it. Or I tried and it didn't go anywhere. So the think it up stage is really critical. Then when it's writing, when they're writing the first draft, it should be rough. It should be quick, and quick's relative. Some people are very slow writers and some people are faster writers, certainly, but it's not fussy. So we go from the least fussy, which is the think it up, where no idea is really a bad idea. You sort of noodle around. Then you do a draft. Very little judgment because you're just trying to get it down. It's maybe out of order. It may be a mess. You haven't worried too much about punctuation or things like that. When that was first introduced in schools, people were really having fits about this idea of people writing and not doing punctuation or spelling right. And people were just nuts about it because they thought, oh no, we're going to have a whole generation that doesn't know how to punctuate. But really, it's just this second stage of writing where you just sort of get the idea down. And for me as a writer, I write as fast as I can so I don't lose it, right? So that I'm like, oh, this is my train of thought. I don't want to stop and fuss. I want to just lay it down. And so that's that write it up stage. When students are at that stage, they're working through it and they don't need to be fussy about it because they're still trying to put their ideas down on the page. And then there's the fix it up. And that's where the revision happens. That's where people get fussier and fussier. And as a writer myself, I'm a novelist, and I tell people I am an English teacher, but when I'm writing a first draft, I'm not an English teacher. I'm like, I don't know. I rename a character. Like in one chapter, it's a cat. The next chapter, it's a dog. I'm like, I'll fix it later. It'll all work out, right? And I just write. Because when I get to the fix it up stage, I'm nuts. I am like, is that a comma? Is that an extra space? Should this be this? Should this be, is and the right word, or should it be this? I get really, really particular. So there's a place for that, and that needs to happen at that fix it up stage. And there are degrees of the fix it up. There's the first sort of run through, and I'll talk about that. And then there's the, super polished stuff. And at the fix it up stage, that's where I love that revision means to see again. It's not just fixing commas. It's really looking at a piece and saying, does it work? And how can it work better? Just really re-looking at it. This is where we get feedback most of the time. You as coaches will be giving feedback at all of these stages. You'll run into students at all of these stages. But for most of us as writers, we have a draft and then we really need other readers. And it is critical to get readers at that point, because without feedback, you can only see so much in your own work. no matter what. It's just super hard to see when it's yours. And so again, think it up, write it up, fix it up, more and more fussy as you go. When people get really bogged down with the write it up part, it's often because they haven't thought enough about it. And so they don't have enough direction to put their thoughts down, or they're jumping ahead and they're starting to be fussy when the goal is to just get it on the page. When students are really, it's really hard for them to write because they can't not fix everything up. And some of you know, like some of you are that person, right? Where you're like, I write 2 words and I get rid of one. It really helps people when they're tired. Honestly, I tell students, if you're super fussy, then you should be tired when you write, because then you're freer. And so knowing where they're at, and those are some of the things I look for, is this person already, they have 2 paragraphs down and they're obsessing over a comma. I'm like, okay, that's where we're at. We're at the write it up stage, but they're jumping into fix it up and they need to relax and just get it down on the page. So dividing those states up and then knowing where students are at based on, you kind of seeing how much stuff they've got and again, where they're at. Any questions about that before I kind of move on to now? People are good? Okay. So in general, when I'm giving feedback for folks, I go from, and I wrote on here, positive to negative. Right. And, we're not negative, but positive to negative. Suggestions come after praise, right? First, I'm going to tell you what you've done well, then I'm going to suggest stuff. And sometimes that's tricky. Sometimes, I teach at the college level, and sometimes I see, oof, man, I'm like, wow, what do I got here? And where are we going to start? There's always something. Sometimes it's a sentence. Sometimes it's a little, maybe they've nailed paragraphs. Everything else is all over the place, but they've really got a feel for that. So whatever it is, I always start with that thing. And I say, you know what, I see this works really well. And we do it obviously for a couple of reasons. One is that when people share writing, which is always personal, it's always personal. It doesn't matter if it's a research paper. There's something about writing that really comes from you and it is personal. And you get used to that feeling of having people read over time, but it never fully goes away, that discomfort. It doesn't go away for me. And I've been critiqued a million times. I get critiqued online anonymously. So, right? It's uncomfortable, but you get used to that discomfort. But newer students don't have that experience yet. And so we let people know that because they've shared with us, which is a real gift when someone does that. But we also need to let people know what they've done well so they can repeat it. And we have a tendency in teaching to point out what people aren't good at. If you struggled in a math class, you probably heard you need to take more math classes. And I'm like, do you? Probably not. You're never going to do math in your professional life at that level. You're not very good at it. So maybe you should do more of what you're really good at. And it's true with writing. If you say to somebody, you have this piece where you were doing a personal essay and there's this beautiful description and your descriptions are really great, I guarantee you they don't know that about their own writing. And the minute they hear that, then they're forced to look at that. And then they'll say, I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to really do more of what I'm good at. And so that's the other reason that we point those things out. They may have, if you hadn't said it, they may chuck the good parts because no one said this part really, really worked for me as a reader. So positive to negative, there's always that, the compliment sandwich too, where you start with something positive, you give your suggestions, and then you end with something positive so that at the end of it, they feel good about it. And again, anytime you're doing that, it obviously needs to be genuine, but it can always be genuine. There is, sometimes I've looked at essays where I had to look pretty hard to find something to say, but there's always something that you can say that they've that they've managed in there. The other thing is I always critique big to small. So the big chunks before I get down to the little stuff. And that's because I think of it as if I were remodeling this room and I'm really just going to take everything back to the studs and I'm going to do stuff, I wouldn't start this big remodel job by first replacing the carpet or painting the trim, because then once the wall's torn out or whatever, it's messed up. First, you have to start with the big stuff. Is this wall going to stay? Is the carpet going to get ripped out? And then once you've done the big stuff, then you do stuff like, oh, I'm going to put a picture up. I'm going to put a chair here. So you always start big to little. If you start looking at the little stuff of a paragraph, for example, and then as you're going along, you realize the suggestion is that first paragraph needs to go. Then everyone's wasted time worrying about the little stuff in that, when actually bigger pieces need to move around or be cut or added. So I always go big to small. And again, that's why grammar is always the last thing that I talk about. And the impulse is always that grammar is the first thing we talk about. It's comforting to talk about grammar because there are actual rules, right? Writing is an art, no matter what anybody says about it, and no matter what kind of writing it is. It can be a feasibility report, and there's still an art to the writing of it. And you can have a template, like a 5-paragraph essay. You can do anything you want and have some structure, but when you're looking at it, it's still art, and you're still trying to figure out that communication that the person has put on the page. But grammar overall, there's some flexibility in grammar, but pretty much rules are rules. This really is a sentence. This really is a fragment. This really is a run-on, and this really does need to be capitalized. And so that's comforting when you're giving advice, because that I've got this rule down, and I know that this is real. And the rest of it is fuzzier. It's what I love about writing. It's what I love about writing myself, and it's what I love about working with people with writing, is the art of it, the flexibility of it. If you did this, people might respond this way. And if you move this over here, then we would get your ideas in a different way, and maybe it builds better. There are lots of ways to do it. But that's why from the big to little, that the last thing I fuss about is the little stuff, like punctuation and that sort of thing. It's critical. And sometimes students are reluctant to, dig in to that final polish to make sure it's okay. But I always think writing is communication, and the burden is on the writer. So if I'm going to ask you to spend 15 minutes reading my essay, whether you're the teacher or whatever, the burden's on me to make sure that's an easy thing for you to do. If I fail on my end with that final check just because I'm being lazy or whatever, I'm like, yeah, whatever, it'll all work out. And I give it to you. And you're the one that has to figure out phonetically spelling, like, what word is this? And there are all these run-ons, and I got thrown out of the piece because I was the work is not on the reader. The work is on the writer. And so it's important. And things like punctuation marks and spelling really matter to the reader. And that's why we do it. So it's super important, but it's always the last thing that I address in a piece. The other thing with feedback is the more specific, the better. When someone says, I was, the beginning flowed really well, and then I kind of got lost. That's okay. That's a reader response. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's so much better if you can point. If you can say, this paragraph and this paragraph, I was really on board. Then when I got to this paragraph, and all of a sudden it was talking about, Montana statehood, I wasn't sure where that was headed. If you can be specific and if you can point at things, it is really useful for the writer. And you can't always do that. Sometimes when you're reading something, you're just like, the conclusion just felt like it was missing something. And then you can, and I wish I could tell you what, but I don't know. And then you can have a conversation about that, where you say, you know, I felt like I kind of like it stopped, but I wanted another thing. Maybe what could that other thing be? So if you don't have a specific thing you can point to, you can certainly say, I still had this feeling about it, or it felt like this, and then you can problem solve that. But general stuff tends to not be very useful for writers, and specific stuff tends to be. The others, one of the questions that came to me before tonight was the being a reader, reading it as a reader versus reading it as a teacher. And those are two different things. But they're both so critical, and they're both so great to have. And I do both. When I'm sitting with my fiction students, I'll say, as a reader, I really was into that opening. And then I thought this one character was kind of a jerk, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to follow them anymore, right? And I claim it. I'm like, as a reader, this is my experience. That's super useful for people to hear. And then there are times when you know something and you're like, as I'm looking at this, I can see that the teacher wants you to do X, Y, and Z. And I just see X and Y. I'm not seeing Z here. So you can step into a little teacher shoes there as well. When it comes to things like grammar and structure, where you see it and you go, yeah, I know how an essay works. And this doesn't really have a thesis. And so you can certainly read it and approach it as a teacher as well. But there's nothing wrong with giving a reader response at all, because the teacher is the recipient of it, but they're also having a reader response. They're looking for things that they want the student to learn, but they're also going to be experiencing it as a reader. And if something is confusing to you, it's going to be confusing to them also. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I tend to actually use the word as a reader when I'm having that kind of response to a piece of writing. And I think that helps them as well. The other thing I do when I'm talking with students about writing is I tend to use words that are lighter. Like I'll say, just maybe play around with that opening paragraph, right? Or try this thing with that conclusion and run it by somebody else and see if this addition makes that person feel like it has a strong conclusion. And so I tend to use those sorts of things because, again, they're in the revision process. And the revision process is flexible. It's surprisingly creative, which I think a lot of writers love the first draft. They enjoy that. And then when they're being asked to redo it, they feel they're being punished in some way, which is when you guys show up, right? And you're like, my job's to help you do the part you probably don't want to do. And I felt like that as a student, and I felt like that for a long time. I was like, the initial writing's fun and interesting, and then I'm done. But to see it as a revision and to appreciate how creative the redo of anything is really makes that fun. And seeing stuff get polished up and get better also makes a big difference. And is pretty inspiring when you're working. So I use words like that just to kind of lighten the feel, rather than, put your nose to the grindstone and really just like run spell check. Although I do say that a lot to my college students. I'm like, is spell check not working on your and then I'm like, I did it. I'm like, no, I promise you that this word not would have been flagged. The other thing is, talking is so much easier than writing. We do so much more of it. I'm a writer, and I still have done a million times more talking in my life than writing. So when people are trying to figure something out, writing, having a conversation, which is where you guys show up, really makes a big difference. And what I like to do is I like to take notes for the writer. So the students are terrible at taking notes as you're talking to them. And they're not very good at taking notes, even if they know they need to. Like I've said to students, you need to write down what people in workshops say to you. They're like, yeah, yeah. And then they start listening and they don't. So when I sit with a student one-on-one, I take notes for them. So we're chatting and I'm like, hey, I was a little bit confused by your intro. What do you think your thesis statement is, right? And then they'll say it usually really well. And I write it down for them. And then we have this conversation and I'm writing down what they're saying. And at the end of it, I hand them that sheet of paper. It really makes a big difference. They've got a guide to look at. They're not going to remember what was said very well, and they're not going to take very good notes. And when I hand them, they love it. Oh, that's a good question. You know what? No, I've never had a student who was like, where did you go? You were taking notes in the conversation. I'll say, they'll see me and I'm like, hey, what about this? And then I write a couple things down. And then when I hand it to them, students just feel like you've given them this huge gift. It's just like, and I've had students say to me, will you leave that so I can copy it? Like, yeah, I don't want this. It's for your essay. and I rip it off and I give it to them. That can just really help. The other thing too is that the chatting about it, and again, you don't have to write stuff down, but the chatting about it is that in communication with humans, we're really much better at things, again, than we are with writing. So if I say to a student, I know you're struggling with your thesis statement, and they are looking at their paper, and I'm asking them about it, and they start reading sentences or whatever that are absolutely not the thesis statement. You've all been there with students, right? They're like, oh, it's this, or you're like, it's not, I promise it's none of those things. What I'll say to them is like, look away from the writing. You and I are sitting here, and then just tell me, I'm your neighbor, I'm at lunch or whatever, we're sitting in the cafeteria, and I'm like, oh, I know you have this assignment, and then you tell me what it's about. And almost always they do a very good job of it. Well, it's really about how in the early days of Montana, life was so hard that only certain people managed to succeed at it. And because of that, blah. They're like, great, that's your thesis statement. And we'll polish it up so that it looks like a thesis statement, but basically the heart of it is that thing that you just said. Cassie, did you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick.
Yeah,
I know.
you bet.
No. I'm just excited about some of the things you're saying. And you work with college students, and we work with actually 4 through 12. And one of the things we kind of gone back and forth with and had debates about is taking notes for students. And we've landed at this present moment on coaches should not take notes for students, because then it's so hard as adults over minors. There's like this power dynamic, right? Between whether it's a 20-year-old or a 70-year-old coach and a 12-year-old, right? That oftentimes the students walk away going, oh, I have to say this. My coach told me I have to say this, versus maybe a 20-year-old in your class who goes, I know I have creative license. I know my teacher is guiding me. So what we usually, because I think you're right, some students, there's different learning disabilities or things, or just processing where they can't take the notes simultaneously. So sometimes we encourage coaches to pause and say, oh, you just said something brilliant, make a note in your document now. Or I've seen coaches take notes and then at the end leave 5 minutes to be like, if you want to copy some of my notes down, put it into your own words on a piece of paper for yourself. Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify that we've gone back and forth about that, and it's tough. But then I wanted to get a little nerdy with you and ask a question. Because one of the things that you brought up that I just love is this idea that writing is grammar, or writing has to be perfect the first time out. We all know that's not true because we've dove into the writing process, but there's this misperception, not only for students, but oftentimes for a lot of adults who come in to be as volunteers. They think it's going to be grammar. That's what they grew up with. And then we talk to them about taking a step back, doing developmental editing, letting students look at the big picture first. I wanted to hear from you in your teaching perspective. how have you changed people's perceptions or encouraged people to change their perception of writing and what writing is? Because I would imagine you have people come into your classroom in the same ways that we do, expecting something about this is what writing is versus no, it's actually very creative, or whatever it is. And then on
Right.
top of that, just to make it really fun and political, where do you feel like AI is in our
Oh,
development
yeah.
of what
Right.
writing is? Because if we think that writing is perfect grammar, yeah, maybe AI spits out something that's grammatically correct. But I have a friend who is a tribal member who asked AI, "Hey, can you tell me about my tribe?" It sounded beautiful. Everything was wrong. He said everything was wrong because they don't have citations. They didn't source things correctly. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess it's a two-part question and it's pretty loaded. And I just really want to hear what you have to say about it. That would be great.
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So first to clarify what I do give my students notes about what I think, right? Because that's, they're adults and that's what they're there for. So I give them notes and I'm like, I would, check this out and do this. And, this isn't formatted right or whatever it is. But what I'm really talking about with you guys sitting is you write down what they say. Yeah, because they say it and it's really good. And they're not writing that down because they're saying it. And then they won't remember later what they said. So I'm at that point, I just write down what they say. And in that way, I'm not guiding anything. I'm asking the question, like, what do you think the essay is about? And what do you think 3 important things might be that would be some evidence for that? And then they say this, this, and this. And so I'm actually like they're dictating to me. And that's what I hand them. So in that way, no, I'm not giving them that. Yeah, Mary Louise?
Yeah, I have to take a little issue with this, for this
Sure.
age group.
Yeah.
I really, okay, there is enough time and their attention can stay focused from one step to the next to move through this
Sure.
process while they take notes. I can help focus their attention. And when they come up with a brilliant statement, it's like, oh, I go, oh my gosh, that's it. Write it down right now. Put it down. And I said, anywhere on that paper, the side, you just cram it in there.
Yeah.
Good. Now let's move on here. Now the next piece is this. Now what? So I can help track them, but now it's on their paper. It's from their mouth. It's with their hand. It's 100% ownership.
Oh,
and
yeah. Yeah.
I just find that is so important because cross-culturally, when I've dealt with cross-cultural or even just straight teaching, but people with different backgrounds, whatever, different vocabulary. If I accidentally misuse a word or plug in a different word, all of a sudden that student or that person moves 3 feet back. They don't want to engage with me anymore. I've just offended them because I used one vocabulary word instead of another. I never want to do that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And really, it's also a student by student. I mean, I've had students who I say something and they're just like tapping away, or they'll stop in the middle of a conversation and they'll write a bunch of stuff down because it came to them. And then I've had students who, we could meet for hours and afterwards, they're not writing anything down. They're not retaining anything. But yeah, stopping and making. I think the younger they are, the better that probably is, for sure. The other thing is, Cassie, one of your questions, writing, people thinking writing, it really is about grammar, not the bigger picture. And I have adults in continuing ed classes who sometimes will say, I've always wanted to be a writer, but I have really bad handwriting, or I'm bad at spelling, whatever it is, as opposed to this larger picture of what writing is about. And I think that it's really easy to convince people because the rest of it's way more fun. And so it really is not a hard sell when I say to someone, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to come up with 5 ideas for a personal essay, and then you're going to pick one and you're going to noodle around for a while, and then you're going to write a rough draft super fast, and then you're going to get feedback and go through it. They're on board because it's a lot less painful to do that than to really just drill down into, I'm going to quiz you. And sometimes I did, because otherwise people weren't really remembering grammar rules in a way that would be useful to them down the road, right? That needs to happen too. But yeah, no, it's a pretty easy sell because people love the creativity of writing. Even if it doesn't appear to be a creative writing kind of thing. When it comes to AI, I think of AI right now. I mean, it's tricky as a teacher for sure. I mean, I'm teaching fiction, so it's not that tricky. I know where they're at and what they're writing and that sort of thing. I think of it like Cliff Notes. Right, there were people who would read Cliff Notes and not the book, and then they would flunk the tests. Right. And then there were people who would read the book and be confused because they might not get the bigger picture. And then there were some of us who, if it was a particularly difficult thing to read, we read the book and we had the Cliff Notes. Right. I read Chaucer in the Middle English, like the original Chaucer, for a class, and I was just like pulling my hair out. And so I had Cliff Notes, and I'd be like, okay, this chapter is going to be about this. Then I would wade through the horrific English, and that helped me. And I've used AI. I mean, one of my favorite programs is Grammarly for checking. I send students to Grammarly all the time, but I love getting a draft of a piece of writing that I don't want to do. A piece of writing that just needs to be done. Like I did a press release this spring for a book signing, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to write that. And so I used AI and got a draft of it. And from that, then I went in and I changed stuff up and I polished it. But somebody, right, knocked out the rough draft for me, and I could then go through and fix it. And so I think it definitely has a place. And but again, you can't rely on Cliff Notes to get through stuff. And once you've got the skill set, then it's terrific to use when you need it. But yeah, and the dangers of it, the whatever of it, are just, yeah. But on the other hand, there are those grunt jobs. I mean, I wish AI could clean my bathroom. Right? Like, that's not a skill set I care to keep having. And so some of these pieces of writing that just kind of need to be done, I think it's pretty handy for that. Yeah. Let's see. All right. Yeah, AI is tricky. Rita's question about someone who doesn't have a handle on what they've written because, they might not have written it. Teachers too. The nice thing is, as a coach, you can certainly talk about that a little bit, but the burden of it's going to fall on the teacher to try to parse out what's them and what's not them. And there are all these checkers. I just talked to a teacher at the college the other day who said, I've got this piece of writing that's 46% AI. From running it through checkers. And then she was trying to figure out, okay, how do I need to talk to the student about, and I think it was a research paper, so that gets trickier, right? It's like, you're adding stuff that's not in your language, not in your words. So yeah, it's tricky stuff. If I saw a lot of it in a piece as a coach, I think I would mention it to the teacher and then know that that was really all that I could probably do. But I think you're right, Rita, just to suggest that people use their own words. And I also tell people, when I was working in the writing lab, I would say, you know what, if I notice something, I guarantee you the teacher's going to notice it. So think of me as it's like a little warning you get for speeding and not the ticket. So I just gave you that little, you know what, you can take this advice or not. But the teacher will definitely notice that as well. Let's see. And, oh, nice. So I'm going to finish up this and then we'll have time for questions. So talking is easier than writing. Also, talking works really well for paragraph transitions. You've probably seen that where, it's like one paragraph's about Edison inventing the phone, and the next paragraph is the percentage of teens that are on their phones 8 hours a day. And you're like, it's like whiplash, right? Like, how do we get from here to here? But if a student tells you, I'm sitting there having a talk with you and you're telling me about Edison and the invention of the phone, you wouldn't just say, 86% of teens spend 8 hours a day on their phones. I'd be like, what are you talking about? You would say to me, from the early beginnings, he couldn't have anticipated how bad it would get with all of us with our phones. You would say a transition. So if I can get a student to say a transition in a chat with me, they'll inevitably be able to write that transition. But it just didn't end up on the page. And then potential help for some things that can come up with students. And these are sort of things I've made up, but they're real. Waffling, right? Students, you'll talk to a student, they can't pick a topic, they don't know where to start something, there's the sort of waffling that goes on. I would tell people, imagine that you can't leave this room until you've written this thing, right? Like, take the decision making off the table and just say, you know what? Let's say you had to do it right now. What would it be? And whatever that is, whatever that thing is that comes to them, that's the thing to do. Or you have to start this essay and you're like, I should have a paragraph, but I don't. What would you do? If it right now, like you can't, there's a treat in the next room and you can't go get that treat until you've written this one, what would it be? And then it kind of gives them that time that allows them to then say that thing. And I'm like, jump on that first thing. That's usually your best idea. The other, I talked about this a little bit, which I think of as triage when I see a piece of writing that is just really a hot mess. I'm like, wow, okay, there's just like so much going on. We have a limited time. And if I start to tell you all the things that I'm seeing in this, you're going to short out like any human would, right? And so I always think, okay, what is one thing I can focus on right now with this writer that will move the ball forward a little bit for them? And sometimes it's stuff like, you can indent paragraphs and that makes reading a lot easier for the reader. So you want to take a look at maybe where they are. Or I see, words confused, like they've got there, and there, or things that'll just forever run through word processing usually pretty well. And so maybe I'll be like, hey, do you want to do this? Or just go through a couple sentences. If you see a bunch of run-ons, whatever it might be, I'm always like, what's the thing I can do that might help move the ball forward for them rather than tackling too much stuff at any given time. And then the final thing is resistance. And the resistance sometimes is, to writing anything, where you get someone who and that can be two things. One is they're perfectionists. And so it doesn't look like perfectionism. It looks like procrastination. It looks like I'm giving up and I'm not starting and all of those things. But often that's a perfectionist. I don't want to start this because I don't know how to make it perfect already. And when I run into a student like that, and you usually know pretty quickly when you run into that with a student where they're really good at stuff and they're not writing because it has to be just right. And I always just remind them, that first draft is written freely. You just have to just get it down and write it as fast as you can. And it sort of short circuits that fussiness. And then just keep moving along. So that's one kind of resistance I see. The other kind of resistance I see is people who genuinely don't like writing. It's just not their thing, right? It's not their thing. And I just really try to be empathetic about that because I don't like math. And I always say that. I'm like, I get it. I love writing, that's my thing, but I don't like math. And if you run into someone who doesn't like to write, 99% of the time, they're good at things like math. Right? I mean, I always think there's this, when you divide up a campus and you have the sort of Englishy things on one side and the sort of math and sciencey things on the other side, you know, you have a tribe. And so when a student who really doesn't like to write, and then I say, I get it, because I am really bad at math. I struggle with math. I don't like math. I never have. And then they'll say, I'm pretty good at math. I'm pretty good at math. And I'm like, yeah, I bet you are pretty good at math. But I know what it's like to not love that thing that you're doing. So I'm not, just because I'm here because I like to write doesn't mean that I think everybody should like it. I get it. I get not liking it. That said, this is the super bad news about writing, is that you have to do it all the way through your education and professionally. It just is almost impossible to avoid it. And so as a result, you have to have skills to a certain level. And I always say, I am so sorry that is the case, but that's the case. And then sometimes with folks, I'll say, you know, they'll say, well, I'm, and obviously I'm working with adults, although I have lots of high school students in my classes through Running Start. But they'll say things like, well, I'm going to be a nurse. I'm like, you're going to write a lot as a nurse. And it's important because if you get something wrong on your report, bad things can happen, right? Or it's shocking. Police officers write so much. My husband was a juvenile probation officer, and he wrote more professionally than I have ever written professionally in my teaching life. He wrote all the time. And so I remind people, you think, you know, or I get students sometimes who are in, they'll be in small engine repair, or they'll be in, you know, going to be a driver or something. And I'm like, you may want your own business at some point. And who's going to write the stuff about your business? Who's going to do the marketing? Who's going to do all of that? It's you. So it's really inevitable that you have to write. And so I kind of remind them that it's okay to not like it, but there's a certain level that you're going to have to really be able to master. And then there's resistance to getting feedback. And that is, it's worse with newer writers. So the newer the writer, the more reluctant they tend to be about feedback. And the longer people have written, the more comfortable they are with writing, the better they are with writing, they tend to be more open, which is the opposite of what you think. And I just remind people that all good writing is rewriting. And I would love to just write something and then give it to people to read and have them just be like, you know what, I can't go on. It's so spectacular. Don't change a word. I would love that. I would love that to happen. And it does not happen. So all writing is rewriting. And I tell my creative writers who, or sometimes, you know, they'll be really prickly about it because, well, I did this thing and maybe you don't understand my vision, which I sometimes get, right? And then I do this little thing where I'll say, you know, I'm in a critique group with multi-published authors. And not only do they love to get feedback, but they are hungry for feedback. They don't let you out. They don't let you out of the room until you have absolutely given them everything you can possibly give them. And that is why they're where they're at. It's not that they got to the point where they're like, okay, good, I know everything, I'm good now. You never do. It's constant growth in that area. The other thing sometimes when they're reluctant or they feel they're resistant, is that it's just too much. And you don't know what their too much is gonna be. I think of that, one of my favorite Far Side cartoons is where there's a classroom and there's this big kid and he has this little tiny head and he's raising his hand and he's like, you know, Mrs. Johnson, my head's full. And it's one of I see it all the time as a teacher. So I'm teaching and I'm looking out there and then all of a sudden there's that moment. And I'm like, they're done. and I may not be done. There may be things I still would like to cover, but I can see that it's the end of it. And then I move on to something else, push it to the next day. Sometimes when you're talking to people, they can handle lots of feedback on their writing. And sometimes you say one thing and you can tell it's just not gonna go beyond that. And then you just enjoy that moment and move on. I'm gonna get you next time, right? I'm gonna cover the next thing the next time. And then the other thing with resistance, sometimes you'll get writers who are really good and they know they've got an A. And they know that they can just, whatever they do, they can just write it and turn it in, and the teacher's going to give them an A because they're good enough for that level or better than that level. And you run into those students, and it's not that they're necessarily resistant to feedback. It's that, I already got it. Like, check this box, right? I'm going to get a gold star on this, so I don't really need to do more. And at that point, I'm like, however people come to me, my job is to do this. So if you come in and there are no paragraphs, and it, like, I don't even know where I'm at in space and time when I'm reading it, then you're here and I'm going to bring you to here. If you come in and you are spectacularly strong as a writer, great. This is my job, right? I'm here to help you get better as a writer. And you can always get better as a writer. Always, always, always. And so a really good writer, a really good student sometimes needs that level of encouragement, because it's easy to read their stuff and just go, wow, that's so good, because it is. I'm like, wow, that's so good. Hey, how can you make that better? Right. All right. That's what I had for notes. Questions? See what the... Oh yeah, absolutely. Police, yeah, so many areas. It's just people don't see it coming how much writing they have to do.
Absolutely. We do outreach presentations about what we do, and I hear business leaders from all sectors say, boy, I wish we had that for students or people who came into my sector.
Right.
I think you're right that writing is just a basic skill you need to have, no matter if you're writing an invoice as a plumber or if you're writing something that's about to be published. It really doesn't matter. You need to be able to communicate. So I'm glad that, we're all on the same page.
That's the word too. I think, it's just communication, but it's on the page. And sometimes, we're so in our head and we're trying to do this stuff with language on the page as writers and as students. And I'm like, it's communication. It's a human writing stuff down for another human, and they're going to put their eyeballs on it and they're going to make sense out of it. And don't forget that. Don't forget that this isn't an exercise in me putting words down. It's a human communicating something to someone else, and to be thinking about how the reader is going to take in that information. Teachers are a weird audience because they know everything, right? So, and it's such an academic writing is so odd because that teacher just lectured you about history or about what a government, and then you write a paper about the thing they just taught you to them, and they already know this stuff, right? So it is a weird audience. So you kind of forget that really it is communicating to another human information and all sorts of things. And so don't forget that the eyeballs are, what matter. Questions?
Coaches, please hop in if you have anything for Kathy. Patricia, we did address your reader versus writer versus teacher roles, so you can review the video from earlier. That was a great question. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any questions? We are at 6:30 in a minute, so I want to respect people's time. If folks want to log off, that's great. But if you have more questions, Kathy seems willing.
Yep, I'm here.
Well, Kathy, I don't have any questions, but I wrote down 14 points, very helpful points to consider before my next coaching experience.
Oh, good. Yeah. It's I think it's tricky what you guys do, Of course, right? And it seems straightforward, and it is, but yet it's not. It's tricky too, to talk to people about their writing. It becomes, again, it's a little personal, even when it's not. And so those are kind of tricky conversations. Yeah, Patricia, do you have a question?
Yeah, and this might be more for Cassie, I'm not sure, but do you all in writing coaches, do you all ever get reprimanded by the teachers that we, the volunteers, are misleading or misguiding the students that we work with? Is there anything like that that we should watch out for?
Sorry about my ugly background, everyone. I had to plug in and be outside because I have a sick toddler inside. But anyway, great question. Reprimanded's definitely not the right term. We don't have a relationship like that with teachers, because teachers are the most genius people in the world, in my opinion, because they deal with imperfection all day long, right? They're helping people navigate imperfection. That's their job, to learn and help people grow. So it's always about a partnership. Has it happened where they say, oh yeah, I realized that in general, the coaches kind of steered my students this way, but actually we're going this way. It helps us clarify, and we give that feedback to the coaches, particularly if we're about to do a second round of coaching, right? Because we want to make sure the next round is more accurate according to the teachers. Sometimes it's an individual coach with style, or just hiccups, or the alchemy of the student and the coach in that moment. And then we talk to a coach individually and we get their perception of the experience. And again, we try to make it more of a conversation, because like Kathy was talking about, we embrace a growth mindset. You have to as a writer. You certainly have to as an educator. You put them together as a teacher educator. It's what we do all day long. So I'd say there's very little conflict. I would say more so there's a lot of communication. Our communication with our teacher partners, the relationship just gets stronger and stronger and stronger the longer we work together, because we know each other. And I'll speak, Jeannie is the one on the ground in the Flathead, and of course Kat up here in Missoula River Valley. Those relationships and strengthening those relationships means everything. Did that answer the question? Did that make sense? Yeah. And then I'll be quiet so Sherry can go.
Okay, so this is something that you talked about a little bit at the end, and several times, and that's the thing about me as the coach is I'm the audience for this piece of writing.
Yeah.
And there are times when I feel like they're writing for someone who already knows about this, so they're not really taking care of explaining it to me, the reader. But sometimes I think, well, is that fair? So for example, let's say they're writing something about, well, one of the book, let's say Huck Finn or something. And everybody they've talked to has read it, the teacher's read it, he's read it, I've read it. But sometimes I feel like they're assuming I know things. And I just say, maybe everybody knows this, but as a reader, this is something I kind of need to know, this little detail. Is that okay to do?
Yeah, I think it is. I always think, who's the audience? Who's the ultimate audience for this piece of writing, right? And then from there, you're sort of guided. So the teacher's the ultimate audience of this piece of writing. But even then, the teacher's going to pretend like they don't know everything about Huck Finn, so that the students can write the essay for them, right? But I think that more is usually better. Students do not tend to, they tend to underwrite, right, as opposed to over. And occasionally, it's rare, but occasionally you have that student who's just like, they're just like, oh yeah, it was a 5-page assignment, I wrote 10 just to, but that's a unicorn. And so mostly people don't add enough detail, examples, stuff from the text to back it up, whatever it might be. And that's because it's not so much because they're thinking, I've read it, the teachers read it, but they know what's in their head, and it didn't make it on the page. And so that's one of the things that we count on readers for. I count on readers for that. I know what I meant to write. I know what I was thinking. I know what I intended, but did it land on the page? And then people will read and they'll say, I didn't know what this was. I couldn't picture this. I didn't understand this. And so we rely on readers to tell us what stayed in our head and didn't land on the page. Or it landed on the page and their response to it was something we couldn't have anticipated. And so sometimes we make errors as writers, but they're not really errors. It was just clear in our head. And then it just, right? I didn't guide you enough. It's there, but you had a response I didn't necessarily want you to have. So now I have to go fix it so that I can guide your reading of it better. I wrote the very first novel I ever wrote. I had my book group read, and at one point I had a line in there where, you know how people are frustrated and they do this, right? Yes. So I wrote that she threw up her hands. And you see where I'm going. And so a couple of the women in book group were like, "Oh!" When I first read that, I was like, "What did she threw up on her hands? Like, what is happening?" Right? And I look at it and I thought, okay, I wrote she threw up her hands, but somebody, couple people, had this reading of it. Now I know what I meant. I see what's on the page, but I want to closer guide the reading. I need to reword that so that you have the experience I want you to have. And that's how we write for the reader. And that's how the reader helps us, by pointing those things out. But inevitably, not everything gets from here to the page. Yeah. Other questions?
I'll end with a softball because it's fun. Why do you love doing what you do? Why did you choose to teach writing?
Because I love to write. I love to write. I've always wanted to be a writer, and I've always been a writer. And talking about writing is fun for me. And I've been very careful in my work life to not take jobs that take away from my writing. And so when over the years someone would be like, "Oh, we need someone to edit paralegal documents for blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, absolutely not. Because if I do that for 3 hours or 5 hours or 8 hours, I'm not going to sit down and work on my own writing. So I've been very careful about what I do and what I don't do to make sure my writing is energized. And talking about writing and working with writers is absolutely that for me. So I just keep doing it. I mean, 32 years I've taught writing, and I've gotten more particular about what kind of writing I teach. So I still do. I've got in fact, I have a grammar workshop coming up next week at the college. I'll occasionally do like a little thing that's like that. But when I was teaching college composition, there was a point where I was like, is this really the best use of what I know about writing for me to talk about paragraphs and whatever, when I could be talking about character development or different plot techniques? And so I have gotten more particular about what I teach. But yeah, I like writing, and so talking about it and hanging out with writers, so fun. New writers who've been at it for a long time. It's always very interesting.
Kathy, I do have one more question. I loved your point about the students writing for the teacher. I bring up audience all the time with my students on, what do you want them to walk away with, and other questions I can't think of off the top of my head right now. But anyway, the fact that they are writing for the teacher, I mean, and Cassie and Jeannie as well, I mean, is it appropriate to just flat out ask, I mean, who are you writing this for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is always, who's your audience?
Yeah.
And most writers don't think about it. And that doesn't matter how old they are, they just don't think about it. We're thinking so much about the writing. I'm so focused on the writing and thinking about the writing that I forget that it's a communication that's going to be in the hands of someone else.
Yeah.
And you've got to think about that. In a first draft, it's okay to not think about audience, I think, to just sort of lay out, like, I have a bunch of ideas about Huck Finn, and I'm just going to run and I'm just going to write it down. And then when I revise, I'm going to think, okay, The teacher's going to look at it. She's going to pretend like she doesn't know anything about this story. So I have to back everything up, which is that weird academic audience. But I'm going to now polish it and rewrite for the reader. And so, yeah, I always ask that. And in writing, when you're writing, you're sending out a group email or something, right? Thinking about audience is critical. Right? When, you know, when Cassie wrote to me initially, when I got an email from her, she was thinking we haven't really met. And when she writes to Jeannie, she and Jeannie know each other, right? So we make those adjustments all the time. And in person, it's super easy to do. When we're writing, we need to be more conscious of it.
And Rita, I think the beautiful thing about our position is sometimes we can just be the intermediary for more communication between a teacher and student. Because if you ask a student a question and they don't know the answer, that's what's so fun. We just get to go, hey, Mrs. Smith, could you come over here for a second? Little Charlie isn't sure what the audience is. Have you guys talked about that? And Mrs. Smith might say, we've gone over this 7 times, Charlie. Remember your audience is. Or the teacher might say, oh yeah, we haven't really addressed that. Hey, everybody, listen up. Let's talk about audience for a second. So sometimes, you know, teachers are not going to be able to cover everything in the world. You know, they're just not able to, even if they've been doing their craft a really long time. Sometimes we can provoke a question that just starts more conversation that helps everyone. So I don't think there's anything wrong with asking that question ever. No.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Jeannie?
I can't find my little hand, so I'm just raising.
Your regular hand is, your
Yeah.
non-AI hand is also very good.
No. So Kathy, I just really want to thank you for your whole tone. In anticipation of this, I was thinking, okay, giving feedback in a positive way. What's Kathy going to talk about? And you just have such a wonderful way about you. And I want to thank you because it feels like you're affirming what writing coaches do. The first thing you started out with was know the assignment. And I know I try my best to like get that essence out to my volunteers. And then where are the students in their process? And we talk about, hey, we need to like meet them wherever they are and advance them. And like you said, bring them here.
Yep.
And then going from positive to negatives and reminding us that our writing is art, and remember how personal it is for our students. But I really want to thank you because I've really enjoyed your meetup.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thanks. Was there another? I thought I saw another question somewhere. No? Yes. Patricia?
I think that's a thumbs up.
No.
Affirmation.
Oh, thumbs up. Oh, yeah. It's a different kind of hand.
Well, yeah, I think in just respecting everyone's time, we're just going to say, Kathy, thank you so much. I mean, we're just so delighted not only to learn from you and with you, but WCM is trying to make a big impact. And the more that we can partner with folks like you who are already making an impact in community, the better for everyone. So just thanks everyone. Snaps or claps for Kathy, and thank you for your time.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for volunteering. I tell you what, I was that kid. I would have loved to have had someone to sit and talk about writing with when I was a kid, right? In the schools. It would have just been like extra. It would have been that extra thing that I would have just like loved. So I'm really, really congratulations on the whole thing. It's important work. Yeah. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And Kathy will be in touch to let you know when our appreciation picnic is coming up. We hope that you can get together with coaches and be celebrated together for all this good work. So thanks, everyone. I
almost never say no to free food.
Woohoo! I'm a big fan. Okay, great. All right. Well, hopefully we see you all soon. And thanks, everyone, and have a really good night. Thanks again, Kathy.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Thanks.